Southfield, Michigan, October 14th, 2017. A day that started with hope, love, and the promise of forever. Inside the walls of Evergreen Baptist Church, Pastor Derrick Simmons stood before a congregation that trusted him, respected him, and saw him as a moral compass for the community. His words that day were the kind that linger, vows of devotion, commitment, and unwavering faith. Lydia, standing by his side, believed she had found her soulmate. She believed the life they were about to begin was built on trust and faith. Her smile radiated joy, and her heart was filled with certainty. To everyone watching, it was a perfect moment. But perfection has a way of masking the truth. By midnight, the joyous sound of wedding bells had been replaced by the wail of sirens. The same church that had been a symbol of faith and love now stood as a crime scene. Behind its locked doors, under the glow of dim lights, a horrific discovery had been made. Derrick Simmons, beloved pastor, respected leader, was dead. His lifeless body lay in his office, a bloodied church cross beside him. What happened in the hours between the vows and the breaking dawn? What did Lydia find that shattered the foundation of her new life? And who could have committed such a brutal act in a place meant for peace? This is not a story about love. This is a story about lies, about the cracks that form beneath the surface, and the truths that refuse to stay buried. It was a day filled with joy, laughter, and the kind of warmth that only close-knit communities can offer. October 14th, 2017. The weather was perfect, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of leaves and faint traces of lavender from the bouquets lining the church aisles. Inside Evergreen Baptist Church, Derrick Simmons stood at the center of it all. Known for his ability to connect with everyone, Derrick moved through the crowd with ease, offering a firm handshake here and a warm hug there. His laughter rang out as he shared stories with the guests, his charisma undeniable. For Lydia, the day was everything she had hoped for. In her dressing room, surrounded by family and friends, she couldn't help but smile as she caught glimpses of her reflection in the mirror. Her gown shimmered faintly under the soft lighting, a symbol of the new chapter she was about to begin. The ceremony was intimate, just the way they had planned. Derrick's voice carried across the small church, steady and sincere, as he spoke of love, faith, and the strength of unity. Every word seemed to resonate, drawing soft smiles and nods from those in attendance. To love and to cherish, for better or for worse, he said, his tone filled with conviction. Lydia's gaze met his, her expression one of absolute trust. After the vows were exchanged, the celebration spilled into the reception hall. Glasses clinked, children danced in the open space near the tables, and Derrick's laughter once again became the centerpiece of the room. At one point, he stood to give a toast, his words filled with gratitude for the life he had been blessed with and the woman by his side. "To my wife, Lydia," he said, raising his glass. The room erupted in cheers and applause. From the outside, everything seemed perfect, a moment captured in time, untouched by anything but joy. For Derrick and Lydia, this was the start of something beautiful. But the day, as flawless as it appeared, held shadows that no one could see. Shadows that would only reveal themselves when it was too late.
The reception was winding down. The air in the hall carried the fading sounds of laughter, clinking glasses and soft music. Lydia had been in conversation after conversation, accepting congratulations and hearing countless variations of, "You've married a wonderful man." But now she found herself needing a moment away from it all, a moment to think, to breathe. She moved quietly through the corridors of Evergreen Baptist Church. The dim lighting of the hallway seemed calmer, almost meditative. Yet, as she walked, an unexplainable unease began to creep in. She wasn't sure why, but something was pulling her toward Derrick's study. The door stood before her, closed as always. She had never been inside. Derrick had told her once that it was where he worked on his sermons and kept sensitive church documents. He had said it with such casualness that she never thought to question it. Yet now, on her wedding night, she felt compelled to know more. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Locked. Of course, it was locked. She stepped back, considering for a moment what she was doing. This is ridiculous, she thought. Why am I even... Her eyes caught something on the nearby shelf. A key, small and unremarkable, lying as if forgotten amidst a stack of hymn books. It felt almost too convenient. She hesitated but reached for it, her fingers brushing the metal. It was cold to the touch. Sliding the key into the lock, she turned it slowly. The click echoed in the silence. As the door creaked open, she saw the room for the first time. The space was modest, like the man she believed Derrick to be. A single desk lamp cast a warm but limited glow, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. Books lined the shelves, their spines worn from years of use. The desk was cluttered but not messy. Papers stacked neatly, pens arranged in a holder. At first glance, it seemed exactly what she'd expect from a pastor's private study. But as Lydia stepped closer, her eyes caught something that didn't belong. A drawer, slightly open. The gap was small, but it revealed a glimpse of something that made her pause. She knelt and pulled it open further, her heart already beginning to race. Inside was a plain wooden box, unmarked and unassuming. It was heavier than she expected as she lifted it onto the desk. The air in the room seemed to shift as she opened the lid. What she saw inside made her stomach tighten. Photographs stacked loosely, their edges bent and worn. She picked up the first one. A young woman, her face caught in an expression of unease. Lydia turned it over. No name, no explanation. She picked up another and another. Different women, all with a similar look in their eyes, fear, confusion, or sadness. Her breathing quickened. She set the photos aside and noticed a bundle of letters beneath them. The envelopes were old, the paper inside slightly yellowed. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, and filled with emotion. Lydia began to read. Pastor Derrick, I don't know how to explain this, but I can't take it anymore. I thought you were helping me, but now I feel trapped. Please, don't tell anyone about what you've done. I'll do whatever you ask. The words blurred as tears welled in Lydia's eyes. She skimmed another letter and then another, each more damning than the last. You promised this would stay between us. If my family finds out, I don't know what I'll do. Please stop calling me at home. My husband is starting to notice. The room seemed to close in around her. Her hands trembled as she set the letters down. The man she had exchanged vows with, the man who had stood at the altar hours earlier, was someone entirely different from who she thought he was. As Lydia tried to steady herself, a noise broke the silence. Footsteps. They were faint but deliberate, echoing down the hallway outside. Lydia froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned toward the door, her pulse thundering in her ears. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped, just outside the study. She stood motionless, her mind racing. Should she hide the box, pretend she had never been here? But before she could act, the footsteps started again, retreating this time, fading into the distance. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lydia looked back at the desk, at the photos and letters spread out before her. She had uncovered something terrible, something she didn't yet fully understand. But one thing was clear. Her husband, Derrick Simmons, was not the man she thought he was. Lydia sat in silence, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her like an anchor. The box of photographs and letters remained on the desk in front of her, a reminder of the man Derrick truly was, a man she could no longer recognize. Her breathing was shallow, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't let this go unanswered. The reception had quieted by the time Lydia returned to the main hall. Derrick stood at the center of the room, his familiar laugh carrying softly as he exchanged pleasantries with the remaining guests. To everyone else, he was the same man they had always known. Charming, approachable, kind. But to Lydia, he was a stranger. She approached him slowly, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her dress. "Derrick," she said, her voice steady but low. "I need to talk to you." His smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, nodding and excusing himself from the group. "Of course, darling," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. To the onlookers, it was a loving gesture. To Lydia, it felt cold. The walk to his study was quiet, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. Once inside, Derrick closed the door behind them, his usual calm demeanor still intact. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his tone light, almost dismissive. Lydia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped toward the desk, picking up the box and holding it out to him. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Derrick's expression changed instantly. His smile faded, replaced by something harder, colder. He took the box from her hands and set it down, his movements deliberate. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "It doesn't matter where I found it," Lydia shot back, her anger rising. "What matters is why you have it. Who are these women, Derrick? What have you done to them?" For a moment, he said nothing. His eyes darted to the door, then back to Lydia. The air in the room felt as though it had been stripped of oxygen. Finally, he spoke. "Lydia," he began, his tone measured. "You're overreacting." "Overreacting?" she repeated, her voice breaking. "I read the letters. I saw the photos. These women, they trusted you, and you—" "Stop!" Derrick interrupted, his voice sharp. Lydia froze. This was a tone she had never heard from him before. "I don't think you understand what you're talking about," he continued, his voice regaining its calculated calm. "This isn't what you think it is." "Then tell me," Lydia demanded. "What is it?" Derrick hesitated. For the first time, a crack appeared in his composed exterior. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. "These women came to me for help," he said finally, his voice low. "They were lost, vulnerable. I guided them." "Guided them?" Lydia's voice rose in disbelief. "You call this guidance? You manipulated them, you threatened them. What kind of man—" "Enough!" Derrick's voice thundered through the room, cutting her off. Lydia stepped back instinctively, her heart pounding. His calm facade was gone now, replaced by something far more menacing. "Do you have any idea what you're accusing me of?" he said, his voice dripping with anger. "Do you know what this could do to me, to the church?" "This isn't about the church," Lydia shot back, her anger boiling over. "This is about you and what you've done. You can't hide behind that pulpit anymore." Derrick took a step toward her, his expression dark. "Be very careful, Lydia," he said, his voice a low growl. "You don't want to go down this path." "Is that a threat?" she asked, her voice trembling but defiant. "It's a warning," he replied, his tone icy. The tension in the room was suffocating. Lydia's mind raced as she tried to process the man standing before her. This wasn't the Derrick she had married. This was someone entirely different, someone dangerous. "I won't stay silent," Lydia said finally, her voice firm. "You need to take responsibility for what you've done." Derrick's expression darkened further. He stepped closer, his presence looming over her. "Do you think anyone will believe you?" he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Do you know how easy it would be for me to turn this around on you, to make you the villain?" Lydia's breath caught in her throat. His words were calculated, precise, and designed to instill doubt, but she refused to back down. "I don't care if they believe me," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I know the truth, and so do you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with tension, the silence deafening. Finally, Derrick stepped back, his expression unreadable. "You should go," he said quietly. "We'll talk about this tomorrow." Lydia didn't move. She wanted to press further to demand answers, but something in his tone told her it wasn't safe. Without another word, she turned and left the study, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. As the door closed behind her, Derrick stood alone in the dimly lit room. His gaze fell on the box of photographs and letters. Slowly, he reached for it, his hands steady, his expression blank. Whatever came next, he was already preparing for it. The morning came quietly. The autumn sun peeked over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the small neighborhood of Southfield, Michigan. But inside Evergreen Baptist Church, the calm of the morning was shattered by chaos. A patrol car was parked out front, its red and blue lights flashing against the misty backdrop. Yellow police tape stretched across the church entrance, fluttering in the crisp breeze. Officers moved purposefully, their voices low but urgent. The once sacred space now felt heavy, its silence broken by the occasional camera click as crime scene investigators documented what lay inside. At the center of the room, under the glow of stained glass windows, was Derrick Simmons. The man who had stood at this altar to perform countless weddings, baptisms, and sermons was now lifeless. He lay crumpled near his desk, his white shirt stained deep red. Beside him, the weapon, a heavy church cross, was covered in blood. Detectives circled the scene, their faces unreadable as they assessed the grim tableau. One knelt near Derrick's body, examining the position of the cross. Another sifted through the papers scattered across the desk, noting their contents but finding nothing immediately unusual. And then there were the fingerprints. The lead investigator, Detective Carla James, stepped into the room. Her sharp eyes scanned the space, taking in every detail: the cross, the overturned chair, the faint smudges on the desk. Nothing escaped her notice. "What do we have?" she asked, her voice steady. "Male victim, mid-30s, replied one of the officers. "Blunt force trauma to the head. The weapon appears to be that cross right there, and we found prints, lots of them." Detective James raised an eyebrow. "Whose?" The officer hesitated before answering. "The wife, Lydia Simmons." Outside, Lydia sat in the back of a police car, dressed in a loose pair of pajama pants and an oversized sweater. Her disheveled hair framed her pale face, her expression empty as she stared straight ahead. She didn't resist when the officers placed her under arrest. She didn't say a word. "Lydia Simmons, you're under arrest for the murder of Derrick Simmons," the officer had said. The words played over and over in her mind, hollow and surreal. Back inside the church, the investigation pressed on. Detectives combed through every inch of Derrick's study. The box of photographs and letters sat untouched on the desk, its presence raising more questions than answers. "What about these?" one of the officers asked, gesturing to the box. Detective James glanced at it but didn't respond immediately. She was focused on something else, a faint smear of blood on the edge of the desk, almost unnoticeable in the dim light. She leaned closer, her mind piecing together possibilities. Meanwhile, outside, the small crowd that had gathered whispered among themselves. The news had spread quickly. Derrick Simmons, the beloved pastor, was dead, and his wife, the woman they had seen only the day before, was the prime suspect. "There's no way she did it," one onlooker murmured. "You don't know that," another replied. "Why else would her prints be on the weapon?" But not everyone was convinced. A few of the church members exchanged uneasy glances, their thoughts unspoken but clear. They had seen glimpses of another side of Derrick, a side that wasn't as perfect as his sermons. Inside the station later, Lydia sat in the interrogation room, the fluorescent lights above casting harsh shadows across her face. Detective James entered, her expression unreadable. She placed the photos of the crime scene on the table in front of Lydia, one by one. "Do you know how your fingerprints got on that cross?" James asked, her tone calm but firm. Lydia didn't answer immediately, her hands clenched into fists, her breathing uneven. "I didn't kill him," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then help me understand," James said, leaning forward, "because right now, the evidence says otherwise. Now, here is the question. If Lydia didn't kill Derrick, then who did, and why?" The morning after Derrick Simmons' death, the Southfield Police Department was faced with more than just a murder investigation. What began as a case of domestic violence had cracked open a story so layered, so disturbing, that even the most seasoned investigators paused at what they found. Detective Carla James, known for her sharp instincts and unwavering focus, sat at her desk surrounded by photographs and letters, artifacts of a life that no longer seemed to belong to the man they'd believed Derrick Simmons to be. His death was just the beginning. The first breakthrough came from the photographs. Dozens of faces stared back at the team, women of varying ages, all tied to Derrick in some way. At first, the connection wasn't clear, but as the letters were carefully read, line by line, it all started to take shape. "He told me I was special," one letter began, "that I had a gift no one else could understand." Another read, "If I didn't do what he asked, he said he'd ruin me. He said I'd lose everything." The words were heavy with fear, each sentence written with trembling hands. These weren't just letters. They were pleas. Pleas from women who had been manipulated, controlled, and silenced. Detective James directed her team to contact the women in the photographs. Each call unearthed another layer of the story. "I thought he cared about me," one woman said during her interview. "I thought he was helping me. But then, he started asking for things I didn't want to give. He said it was for my good, that it was part of God's plan." Another survivor, her voice thick with emotion, shared a similar experience. "I was young, barely an adult. He made me feel like I owed him something, like my faith wasn't enough unless I did what he wanted." As more survivors came forward, a pattern emerged, one that revealed years of calculated manipulation. Derrick had positioned himself as a mentor, a confidant, a protector. But behind the closed doors of his study, the truth was far more complex. "He called it counseling," one woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it wasn't, it was control. He made me feel like I couldn't say no." The letters painted the same sentiments. One after another, they described a man who used trust as a weapon, twisting faith into a tool for his gain. "You said no one would believe me," one letter read. "I wanted to leave, but you wouldn't let me. You said I'd regret it." Detective James knew the evidence was damning, but the deeper they looked, the more questions arose. Why had Derrick kept these letters? What had driven him to preserve the very things that could destroy his reputation? But the most pressing question remained unanswered. Who killed Derrick Simmons? Detective James studied the timeline carefully. The box of photographs and letters was discovered by Lydia the night before his death. There had been an argument. But was that enough to drive her to murder? Or was there something, or someone they hadn't accounted for yet? And then came a name. Whispered in interviews, hinted at in letters. A name that had been overlooked at first, but now stood out like a beacon. "She tried to leave," one survivor said. She told me she couldn't handle it anymore. Another added, she was scared. She said he wouldn't let her go. The name was circled on the whiteboard in bold red ink. She wasn't in the box of letters, but her connection to Derrick was undeniable. And as Detective James prepared to bring her in, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. For weeks, the investigation into Derrick Simmons' murder had focused on Lydia Simmons, the wife who had uncovered his secrets. But as Detective Carla James and her team pieced together the stories of the women Derrick had manipulated, another name emerged. A name mentioned during the interviews, scrawled in hurried letters, and tied to one word: desperation. Her name was Jasmine Taylor. Jasmine was 24, a former member of Derrick's congregation who had left the church abruptly 2 years earlier. At first, her departure seemed unremarkable, one of many who quietly drifted away from their communities. But as the stories unfolded, Jasmine's connection to Derrick became impossible to ignore. She told me she was afraid, one survivor said, afraid of what he would do if she didn't keep quiet. Another woman added, Jasmine tried to warn me once, but I didn't listen. She said Derrick would destroy her if she didn't obey him. It was late one evening in the fall of 2015. Jasmine sat alone in the church office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Derrick stood across from her, his voice calm but firm as he recited scripture, weaving his words into a web of control. "You're chosen, Jasmine," he said, his tone almost tender. "This is your path, and you need to trust me. God's plan is never easy, but it's always right." Jasmine nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, to trust that his intentions were pure. But deep down, doubt gnawed at her. Over the next year, Derrick's grip on Jasmine tightened. He isolated her, making her feel as though she had nowhere else to turn. He used her struggles against her, turning her vulnerabilities into leverage. When Jasmine finally tried to leave the church, Derrick retaliated. He spread rumors, called her late at night, and reminded her of the photos and letters he had collected. Evidence he could twist to ruin her. Jasmine sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone as Derrick's name lit up the screen. She didn't answer, but the messages kept coming. "I know what you're thinking," one read, "but you'll regret this." Another, "You can't escape what you've done. You belong here." She deleted the messages, but the fear remained. 2 years later, Jasmine's name resurfaced during the investigation. She was no longer the scared young woman who had left the church, but someone who carried years of anger, fear, and unresolved trauma. Detective James tracked her down to a modest home outside of Southfield. Jasmine agreed to speak, but her demeanor was guarded. She spoke softly, her eyes darting between the detectives. "I didn't want to go back," Jasmine began, "but I didn't know what else to do. He wouldn't leave me alone." It was the night before Derrick's death. Jasmine stood outside the church, clutching her coat tightly against the cool night air. She hadn't seen him in years, but his messages had started again, cryptic, threatening, impossible to ignore. She entered the church through the side door, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The light in Derrick's office spilled into the corridor, and her heart pounded as she approached. "Jasmine," Derrick said when he saw her, his voice calm but laced with something unspoken. "I knew you'd come back." Jasmine's hands shook as she stepped inside. "This has to stop," she said. "You can't keep doing this." Derrick smiled, the kind of smile that had once put her at ease but now made her skin crawl. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his tone sharpening. The argument escalated. Derrick's calm facade cracked as Jasmine refused to back down. He stepped toward her, his voice rising. "Do you think you can walk away from this? From me?" Jasmine reached for the cross on his desk, her fingers wrapping tightly around the smooth wood. "You don't control me anymore," she said, tears streaming down her face. In the heat of the moment, the weight of years of fear and anger took over. The next thing she remembered was the sound, a dull, heavy thud, and Derrick's lifeless body crumpling to the floor. Jasmine sat in silence as she finished her story. The detectives listened, their expressions grim. Her confession was raw, filled with pain and a deep sense of regret. "I didn't mean to kill him," she said, her voice trembling. "I just wanted it to stop. I wanted to be free." Detective James leaned back in her chair, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. The box of photographs, the letters, the whispered warnings, they all pointed to one thing. Jasmine wasn't just a victim of Derrick's manipulation. She was the one who had ended it. As the news broke, the community was left reeling once again. The story of Jasmine Taylor, a young woman pushed to the brink, added yet another layer to the tragedy. For the women Derrick had harmed, Jasmine's actions were a turning point. While they couldn't condone what she had done, many saw her as a symbol of resistance, of courage in the face of unbearable pain. For Detective James, the case was closed, but the scars it left behind would linger for years. And for Lydia Simmons, the woman who had uncovered her husband's secrets, the truth was both a relief and a burden. She had survived Derrick's lies, but the cost of those lies was a weight she would carry forever. As the investigation came to a close, Jasmine Taylor's name became synonymous with both tragedy and resilience. Her confession had brought the truth to light, but her actions left the court and the community divided. "I didn't want this," Jasmine had said during her sentencing. "But when you've been pushed to the edge, when you feel like there's no way out, sometimes you make choices you can't take back." Her words lingered in the courtroom, heavy with the weight of years of pain. Survivors nodded in quiet agreement, their own experiences echoing Jasmine's desperation. Jasmine's sentencing marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For the women Derrick had silenced, it was a chance to reclaim their voices. And for Lydia, it was a moment to redefine her purpose. "This isn't just about what Derrick did," Lydia said during a televised interview. "It's about what happens now. It's about making sure no one else falls through the cracks. We have to be better. We have to protect each other." Lydia Simmons, the woman who had uncovered the man behind the mask, now stood at the center of a movement she never intended to lead. Her discovery, once a source of shame and fear, had become the cornerstone of something much greater. "When I stood in this very church, I believed in the man I was marrying," Lydia said during a public gathering. Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering. "But what I've come to realize is that belief is not enough. We must demand accountability. We must demand the truth." The crowd was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Among them sat survivors, women who had lived through Derrick's manipulation, their faces a mixture of pain and relief. For years, their stories had gone untold, their voices silenced. But now, they were no longer alone. The church, once filled with Derrick's sermons, now stood as a reminder of the cost of silence. Its pews were emptier, its congregation smaller, but those who remained were determined to rebuild. The walls that had once hidden so much now bore the weight of transparency and healing. In the end, the legacy of Derrick Simmons was not the man himself, but the strength of those who rose in the wake of his destruction. Lydia, Jasmine, and the survivors were no longer victims. They were warriors, their voices carrying far beyond the walls of Southfield. What are your thoughts on Lydia's journey? and the twists that unraveled in this story. Could you see it ending any other way? Let us know your theories and reactions in the comments below. If you found this story gripping, make sure to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into true crime mysteries. Don't miss our next story. It might just leave you questioning everything you thought you knew.